Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's National Arts Club program. My name is Angela Louie. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we're a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts and to educate the American people in the fine arts. Annually, the club offers more than 150 free programs to the public, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures, and readings. For more information about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Following the conversation today will be a brief Q&A, so please feel free to use the chat or Q&A function for any questions you might have. Now, today's program is The Dress Diary, Secrets from a Victorian Woman's Wardrobe, and our guest is the author, Dr. Kate Strasdin. Her book is available in the chat with the link. It's also available in all major bookstores. So check the link, check the chat for the link to her book. Dr. Kate Strasdin is a fashion historian, museum curator, and lecturer at Falmouth University, where she teaches the history of fashion design, marketing, and photography. Please welcome Dr. Kate Strasdin.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Angela, and thanks so much for inviting me to present today. I hope that you enjoy this this brief entry into the world of a very special gift. I shall share the screen with you now so that you can see what is the journey really that I made for 6 years ago, in fact 7 years ago. In January 2016 is where it all began. But I think I ought to start with really what is a dress diary. So many of you may be familiar with the volume that's in the Victorian and Albert Museum in London. It was a very famous book that I was aware of as a young curator. It was on the bookshelves in the museum that I worked in, and it was the album that belonged to Barbara Johnson. Barbara Johnson was a woman in the 18th century who kept a record of her clothing via swatches. You can see some on the page here. She would pin little pieces of fabric from the material that she bought from the drapers or the haberdashers, and she would record how much she paid for it, where she bought it, and what it was going to be made into. Sometimes she would include small illustrations. You can see the detail on the left. She wrote a blue spotted muslin gown, 6 yards L wide, and then that it was made at Bath in April 1812. There were more than 100 swatches in Barbara Johnson's album, dating from the mid to late 18th and to the early 19th century. And it's pretty unique in that I've certainly never come across another like it in the UK, at least. So the term dress diary is kind of something that I made up, but you'll see why. Scraps are really poignant things. There are other examples of scraps being attached to ledgers in the past. This is one of my favourites, in as much as it's just a beautiful and very poignant collection of swatches. In the London Metropolitan Archive, there are volumes that were associated with the Foundling Museum in London. The Foundling Museum was formed to take the children, the babies of women that could not manage to look after them in the 18th century, specifically working class women who were just unable to care for their children. When they gave the baby to the Foundling Hospital, they would leave a token behind. And the aim of the token was that they would keep one half and they would leave the other half with the details of their baby, and that they would reclaim their child at some point in the future. And that almost never happened. But what is left is this amazing record of working class dress that we might suppose to be drab and colourless. And actually, it's this very vibrant record of all sorts of different textiles attached to the names of these babies. So scraps can be very, very powerful. They can also be associated with things like business records. So museums do hold albums of different colorways. These are fabric scraps from they could be from dye works, they could be from weavers. And so you see collections that have these different samples of scraps, and they're very beautiful, but they serve a very specific purpose. I think many of us can appreciate the idea of fabric as memory, and that fabric can be a very poignant way of remembering things. We can all remember the fabrics of a particular garment that we wore at different points in our lives, be it special occasions, things from our childhood, things that our parents wore. And the idea of that being turned into a quilt, for example, you know, there in the US, the album quilts and the amazing kind of records that people have telling stories through dress. And so they can offer those very powerful memories. And I inherited my grandmother's button tin after she passed away several years ago. And I can remember her telling me, I used to pull the buttons out on the carpet, and I could remember her telling me which garment various buttons had belonged to, and I would sort through them and she would tell me stories. So these tiny ephemeral things might have very little value in and of themselves, and yet they contain a great deal of our history. So where did this project come from? Well, I belong to a lace group. When my kids were very small, I had two young boys, and I had started to learn to make Honiton lace, which is a very fine, I'm sure lots of you may be lace makers, and Honiton lace is kind of rooted in the part of the UK that I live. So I live in Devon, and East Devon lace or Honiton lace is particular to this part of the world. And so I had started to learn it in my early 20s. And then when my boys were small, I started to go to a class once a month. It was the first Saturday of every month. And I would go, and it was an opportunity to kind of have a chat, drink coffee, make lace, and just decompress from mum life. And usually once a year, I would give a talk to the group. They knew what I did for a job, and so I would talk to them on a topic related to textiles. And after one of these talks, a lovely one of the lovely members of the group named Francine approached me and said that she had lots of things in her apartment that she needed to get rid of, and would I like to come and see them and take them away? I could take them to our collection at Falmouth University for the students. I could have it whatever I wanted. She just needed to clear her apartment. So I had this very happy, it was January 2016, had this very happy kind of afternoon in Francine's apartment as she just took out object after object, dress patterns, trimmings, embroideries, garments, just so much stuff. And it transpired that Francine had actually been the wardrobe mistress at the National Theatre in London in the 1960s. And this was why she had acquired so many different things. And the very last thing that she took out was this, wrapped in brown paper. It was in a trunk at the bottom of her bed. And as soon as she saw it, she said, "Oh, I'd forgotten I had this." And even before I unwrapped it from the brown paper, I thought it was special. It was weighty, and it looked, the paper had obviously been wrapped around it for a very long time because it had kind of molded itself to the volume within. And when I took the brown paper off, this is what I found. It's slightly bigger than A4 size, so it's quite a good size. And I could see immediately that whatever was in there had made this book very fat. It was probably about an inch and a half at the spine, and that would have been its original size. But the contents, it had grown and grown, and just looked like the most intriguing thing. Francine had acquired it via a young man that worked for her in the 1960s in the theatre. He had been to Camden Market in London one Sunday morning, where they had at that point just junk stalls and cheap, like flea market sort of vendors. And he had bought this for a few pence, knew nothing about it. It didn't have a provenance. It was just there on this kind of junk stand. And he gave it to Francine, thinking that she would find it useful for the theatre and the wardrobe because of what was inside. And when I opened it, I knew immediately that it was a treasure, because page after page after page was full of textile swatches with these little captions in tiny, tiny writing written above them. And I could see dates. I could see 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, and names. There were dozens and dozens of different names. So I knew that it was a special thing, but without a provenance, I didn't think that there was any likelihood that I would be able to find out anything about it. And I assumed it would just be one of these kind of, it would be a beautiful curiosity, but nothing more would reveal itself than that. But I decided that I would at least try. So I thought the best way of doing this would be to start at the very beginning. And I began to transcribe the album. I did this because I thought it was just the only way of kind of unraveling what was there. And that did prove to be the case, because two clues as I transcribed each of these captions, and bearing in mind, I counted the pages, bearing in mind that Barbara Johnson's very important album had more than 100 swatches, and was very, extremely important and significant. I counted the pages of this album from the very beginning. There's over 400 pages, and there are more than 2,000 swatches in the book. So it was kind of no small undertaking to transcribe each of the tiny captions from above each of the swatches. And once I started doing that, two clues revealed themselves. The first one was a place. So above a swatch on one of the pages was a particular kind of caption, and it read, "Emily Taylor's sash, worn to the Preston Guild in 1842. Preston is a town in Lancashire, in the county of Lancashire. And the Preston Guild was, still is, an event that happens every 20 years. And it is about celebrating the guilds of the town." And so this is actually a lithograph, an image from the 1842 Preston Guild at the Guild Ball. So I had a potential location. I had the idea that it could be Lancashire. And then I came across this swatch, and I hope I will read the caption out to you anyway. You can see it's a lovely printed cotton with this little trailing floral design. And the name Anne Sykes had cropped up a lot throughout the captions, but all of the captions were written in the third person. So it might say Fanny Taylor's bonnet ribbon, or Miss Gregg's dress 1845. There would be always names written in the third person, never any particular kind of means of identifying anybody, apart from this one swatch. And this was the one and only time that the owner revealed herself, because the caption reads, "Anne Sykes, May 1840, the first dress I wore in Singapore, November 1840. And so here she was. She had just this one and only time, and the writing is tiny on this caption, the one and only time that she actually kind of waved from the page and said, "It's me, it's my book." And that really was the caption that unlocked everything. Because once I found that, I realized that I had seen a swatch of wedding fabric, or swatches of wedding fabric, that belonged to Anne Sykes and her husband Adam Sykes earlier in the album. And once I knew it was her book, I could track back. And in doing so, anyone that's done any kind of genealogical research at all will know that once you have the names, a potential place, I had Lancashire, and I had the wedding year, 1838, written above the swatches of their wedding dress, it's possible to find them. And I did. I found Anne and Adam Sykes, and they married here. They married in St George's Church in Tyldesley in Lancashire on September the 20th, 1838. Adam was a merchant dealing in textiles, amongst other things. And that one census record, or the marriage record, meant that I was able to just kind of, that's when the network really started to grow. Because I realized that names that featured on the marriage certificate were also names that featured elsewhere in the book. So I knew I'd got the right people. I knew I'd got the right couple. They lived in different dresses around Lancashire, of which more later. And when Anne died, her estate was valued at almost £32,000, which is in excess of £4 million in today's money. So she was a very wealthy woman, certainly by the time she died. And so this wasn't a woman who, my initial feeling had been that maybe she was a dressmaker. She certainly wasn't that. She was someone of means, certainly by the time that she died. And this was the first page where I encountered their wedding clothes. They are just that moment in time, which is lovely. The top left is the dress that Anne wore to the church. So it's this sort of white checkerboard cotton. The sample on the right is Adam's vest, Adam's waistcoat that he wore to the wedding. Then there's the little lace trim that trimmed the dress, and a kind of oyster satin. And you can see when you compare it to garments that survive from that period, the dress on the left is a wedding dress from 1838. You can see that this isn't a person that was provincial in her outlook, I don't think. She was interested in keeping up with fashions, with keeping up with technologies. Her clothes all the way through reveal that she kept up to the minute with things that were happening around her. So the idea, this kind of notion that fashion only happens to people in urban spaces, was really kind of dispelled by the way that Anne was presenting herself. And this became very much about a kind of hidden community of women for me, women whose stories are very rarely told. They aren't necessarily writing very much. They don't keep a diary in the traditional sense, or if they do, they haven't survived. And so these are women who we might see in photographs like this, but we don't get to hear their voices very often. We might see them in fashion plates. Stories such as this might appear in contemporary novels. North and South was particularly useful for me, Elizabeth Gaskell's novel, because it did deal with the idea of Cottonopolis and the city of Manchester, around which Anne's whole kind of childhood and young life grew. That's where she grew up, and how that became a very important part of her life. Because her father was actually a cotton spinner. He was called James Burton, and he owned 4 cotton mills in the town of Tyldesley, where Anne grew up. He'd started out working in printed cottons, and then I think and silk, in fact, but must have been quite a canny chap, because he realised that cotton was where it was going to happen. And so he invested in cotton and opened 4 mills, and he had hundreds of hands that worked for him in his mills. This, of course, became a kind of transatlantic story in that way, because this is the period where, even though slavery had been abolished in the UK earlier in the century, but most of the cotton was coming over from the southern states of America. And so the more than 98% of cotton that were coming into the UK had been picked by the hands of the enslaved, of course. And so this became a story that was complex, in that cotton was such a staple of so many people's wardrobes in Europe and the world at that time. And that was the reality of Anne's father's wealth. And so that was something that wasn't a really important part of this story. Sneaked past that slide there. So this did become about fashionable women, and I was able to see throughout the album that colours and fabrics mapped very closely onto surviving garments, so that you could see that these were women, and there were over 100 different names in the book. And I realised quite quickly that they were names, as I sort of started to uncover the various different names where possible, it became apparent that these were the names of friends and family around Anne. So some of them were her closest family, her mother, her sisters-in-law, her brothers, and then there were close friends and sometimes just acquaintances. So there's a whole kind of spectrum of different women that featured in this book. And decades as well. So you see, for example, the kind of techno textiles of their day, the 1830s printed cottons. These were roller prints that had started to take over from block printing. Block printing was a very skilled and amazing craft that's still practiced in different parts of the world, and particularly India. But it was very labor intensive. And what you had in the early part of the 19th century was the development of copper rollers. The pattern was inscribed onto the rollers, and then you could print cotton lengths at speed and in great quantity. And you could overprint, so you could create a kind of multi-layered patterns. And it really was the kind of technological wonder of its day in terms of fashion and textiles. So you see this throughout the book. And you see how those kind of technologies feature in all sorts of different ways. Here you have the rollers that replaced the blocks, and then it moved into the 1840s. And again, you see Anne's life kind of being charted through the decades. The book runs from 1838 through to the 1870s. And so it's possible to see these changes of style very clearly work their way through the pages. So by the time you get to the 1850s, you can see that playing out. This is, for example, a blue and silver sort of taffeta weave that looks very similar to the surviving dress on the right. This actually belonged to a woman called Miss Brennan in 1853. And I did find out a bit about Miss Brennan, and that's how the dress diary, the book that I wrote, came to look as it does, by which I mean that I decided that I would try and find around 20 women in the book whose story I could tell something about. I could find enough about them to be able to shape a bit of their lives on the page. And then I mapped their life against a particular theme that was relevant to the period. So, for example, with Miss Brennan, she owned a small wares shop. She was essentially a shopkeeper, although a well-to-do one. And so the chapter, as well as telling the story of her life, it was also the story of shopping in that period. So it became sort of part biography, part thematic. See, in the 1860s, these dark backgrounds and floral prints were very popular, and that plays out in the album. And similarly into the 1870s, where you have these sort of bright acid greens, that also becomes very apparent. And I think it's very easy to imagine the idea of the Victorians as these kind of stern, black and white kind of folk who led these unsmiling kind of lives. And of course, photography at that time meant that you weren't able to smile because of the length of exposure required. And so you see these unsmiling figures, but actually the reality of their garments was very, very different, vibrant, bright. They lived colourful lives, as do we. And I think it's sometimes easy to feel differently because we see them in shades of grey. There is a little bit of menswear in the book, not very much. And I think when Anne does include it, it's when she thinks that the colours are perhaps more interesting. And of course, the 19th century was a period of more sober dressing with men, and it tended to be their vests, their waistcoats that were more interesting. So she does include those in the book. These are some of Adam's vests, and you can see just how fashionable he was when you compare an example on the left, a surviving example, with some of the patterns on the right. But I love that she included all sorts of different things. So the striped swatch at the bottom is actually, it says Mr. Sykes' dressing gown, given to him by Fanny for his birthday, July 12th, 1844. I think you could probably still buy a dressing gown that looks like that today. That's very dressing gowny material, and a lovely connection to things that don't really change all that much. There are a few interior fabrics. Anybody that is familiar with a 19th century middle class interior will know how overstuffed they were. This is a watercolor from the late 1830s. And you can see there's no holding back here with pattern, with fabric, with texture. There's all sorts going on. And that was kind of reflected in some of the interiors that Anne included. This was one of my particular favourites. It's a waxed cotton, which made it more robust for furniture. And she's written above it, drawing room furniture print 1841. And you can just see a little piece of cerise above it, which was the curtains for the same room. So there's quite the impactful room there between the leopard print furniture and the bright cerise pink curtains. There are also lots of ribbons in the book, ribbons being such an important part, such an important accessory, because everybody wore bonnets or caps indoors. And so ribbons were really important and they feature prominently. But sadly, they're the thing I was able to find out the least about. And maybe that's something that I could revisit at some point, but they feature a lot. Another of the kind of very important technological advances that features in the book comes through the aniline dyes. The purple that became so popular in the 1850s had been achieved by William Perkin. He was a young chemist working in the UK, and he was actually trying to discover a drug that would help to combat malaria. And he'd created this kind of coal tar sludge as the kind of excess from one of his experiments. And the story as he told it later was that he had knocked over one of his flasks that had this sludge in, and when he went to mop up the sludge, it turned the rag, the white silk rag, bright purple, and it didn't come out. And so unwittingly, he had invented what would become a life-changing invention for him, because it made his fortune. It also made him celebrated. He patented it very quickly. Punch reported in the 1850s that London was suffering from a purple rash. It was this kind of everyone wearing purple everywhere, or the purple measles, because it had just become so popular. And here you can see there's a dress on the right from the period, and you can see that Charlotte, who was actually Anne's niece, had a dress of this in 1853. There's some wonderful international fabrics in the volume. These lovely, sort of beautifully arranged pieces have the caption that said, Syed Amar's dresses, all Arab silks. Syed Amar was actually a merchant trading in Singapore, and this is where Anne and Adam's life took a quite unexpected turn. On July the 1st in 1840, I found Anne and Adam on board a ship from Liverpool. They set sail on July the 1st, and they were sailing for Singapore. Adam had actually been given the job of heading up merchant operations in Singapore, and so Anne travelled with him, and they lived there for the next 7 years of their young married life. The surveyor James Thompson actually recorded the settlement at that time. he captured these watercolour views of the esplanade of Constitution Hill, looking down to the harbour. And it was a place that was not easy for uh, these young women to. It was not an easy place for them to live at that point. It must have felt incredibly far from wet and murky Lancashire. There were tiger attacks quite frequently. There was the climate to contend with, and so it must have been quite the shock. But along with her went her album, in which she carried on fixing her swatches of cloth. There is a really interesting American connection with the in the album. Unusual names are the friend of any researcher, and there were 16 swatches in the book, all printed cottons, that bore the name Mrs. Balestier. And I thought, this is such an unusual name. I must be able to find something. And sure enough, I did. So I managed to find out that she was called Maria Balestier, and she was actually the wife of the first American consul in Singapore, who was called Joseph. But Maria was actually the daughter of Paul Revere. She had grown up in Boston and married Joseph, and when he became had these first sort of diplomatic missions, she left Boston to travel with him in the early 1830s to Singapore. It's safe to say that she absolutely hated it there. The reason I know this is because I've read all of her letters. The Massachusetts Historical Society have digitized her letters that she wrote home to her sister back in Boston, and you get this sense of what the distance was like at that time. At a point now, I mean, I can't really comprehend. You know, here I am talking to you from the southwest of England, and there was Maria writing her letters that she would write to her sister, and they would take months on board a ship to travel back to her sister in Boston, and then her sister's reply would take months to get back to her, and it was the only contact with family. And she writes it in great detail about how unhappy she was. She frequently suffered from fevers. She didn't like the English women at all. She thought they were snooty and a bit stuck up. And so she didn't really form friendships, and I think she was very lonely. Tragically, their only son, who was called Revere, died from fever in the settlement. And sadly, Maria herself also eventually died in the mid 1840s, in 1846, and never made it home to Boston. But her letters have survived and tell this, where Anne's sort of diary is not a diary in as much as we never know what Anne thinks or feels, or the captions are so spare. But this kind of evidence, the letters of Maria, help to fill in some of the blanks left by Anne's less forthcoming captions. She does capture different times of day, of course, so you do see swatches that relate to, for example, Adam's dressing gown. You see day wear in the form of printed cottons, and you see evening wear in the shape of silks. There's a sort of 50-50 split between cotton and silk in the book. It's there's some wool, but not a great deal. It's mostly cotton and silk between the two. There's evidence too of different times of life, different occasions. So these three swatches, for example, read Anna, 3 dresses when in mourning for her mother, 1845. This was somebody called Anna Kubra, who was a great friend of Anne's. She was a bridesmaid at her wedding, and they kept in touch through the years that Anne was living in Singapore. And I think Hannah must have sent her these swatches because it's whilst Anne was still living in Singapore. And it captures this other kind of period of complexity around dress. And so that chapter was about Anna and about the mourning etiquette of the period, which was complicated. In 1840, Jay's London General Mourning Warehouse opened to cater for the very complicated etiquettes that surrounded mourning at that time. the amount of time that you had to wear black, the different stages of mourning. You can see actually with both of these swatches on either side here, they are probably half mourning because they have elements of lilac, of grey, of cream, and so they were worn at the end of the strictest period of mourning. And essentially, Jay's became almost like the first department store, the forerunner of the big department stores, certainly in the UK, because they were selling everything under one roof. They were selling everything you might need when you lost a loved one, your clothes, the stationery, the jewelry, everything that you could get in one place. There's also great evidence of other occasions. A very popular form of fancy dress in the 19th century was to dress in ways that were slightly other to your normal life. The character of Dolly Varden then was somebody who had featured in Charles Dickens' novel Barnaby Rudge, one of his only two of his historical novels. And she was a sort of slightly bawdy barmaid in the novel. And it became, there was a kind of musical written about Dolly Varden later. And there's a lovely swatch in the book that reads Hannah Wrigley's fancy ball dress worn, fancy ball dress worn as the character of Dolly Varden. I don't know who Hannah Wrigley was. I wasn't able to find out who she was, but she was a middle-class girl who was dressing up as a slightly bawdy barmaid, and it's a lovely kind of just another tiny window into this world. Perhaps the most unexpected swatch in the whole volume is one that looks like the least remarkable, really. It's this slightly mothy piece of wool, red wool. It's got moth-eaten around the top. And then you read the caption and realise it's something quite different. It says, part of the pirate's flag taken in Borneo by the Admiral, 1845. I thought, well, there probably couldn't have been very many admirals who were hunting for pirates in 1845 in Borneo. And sure enough, it was fairly easy to find this man, Admiral Sir Thomas Cochrane. He had been tasked by the British Navy to take HMS Agincourt and try to limit the actions of Malay pirates who were attacking merchant shipping vessels at this time. And the red flag, I realized as I was researching the kind of pirate law, the red flag was a pretty terrifying prospect because it actually meant no quarter given, no mercy would be shown. So if these great rowing boats that would dash out of the various settlements along the straits to attack the ships, if they raised their red flag, it was a pretty horrifying prospect. How Anne got a piece of this pirate flag, I have no idea, other than that newspaper records from the Singapore newspapers at the time did record Admiral Cochrane visiting Singapore to resupply his ship at different times, and he was known to visit some of the sort of social events. So I imagine their paths crossed at some point, and somehow she managed to persuade him to give her a little swatch of fabric. In 1849, Anne and Adam moved back to Lancashire, and they lived in various addresses. The first address, the bottom right image there, shows a map of somewhere called Modewheel House, which was near Salford, so just on the edge of Manchester. It doesn't survive now, but they lived in this house. And then they moved to the house that you see on the left, which was called Colthurst Hall, a beautiful, detached, large detached house. At this point, Adam was starting to call himself a gentleman rather than a merchant on the census. And there's a lovely connection with Colthurst in the album because one of the interior fabric swatches actually reads Colthurst Drawing Room 1859. So here they are, here's their house, and here's the fabric that they used to decorate it. There are some slightly random samples. So, for example, there are royal samples that belong to the Queen Adelaide in the book, and I have no idea how they got there. They're just kind of curiosities Anne was in Malta at some point, and I know that Queen Adelaide was in Malta in 1839. But again, how she came to acquire them, I have no idea. Nor do I know how she got a piece of the Princess Royal's dress. Princess Royal was Queen Victoria's eldest daughter, and somehow Anne acquired a little piece of her clothing. There is a lovely connection with a quite different person in the book. And the joys of research are that sometimes things can catch you at different times when you weren't expecting them. So when I transcribed the book, I'd written down the name Margaret Charnock, but it didn't mean anything. It wasn't associated with a date or none of those helpful things when you're doing that kind of research. It was just another name that I couldn't really connect to anyone, but it was associated with this lovely printed cotton. And then I was looking at the 1861 census for Anne and Adam, and suddenly this name jumped out at the bottom of the list of people in their household. And there was the name Margaret Charnock, and she was their cook. I was able to find Margaret in the records, and she had grown up as a farmer's daughter in the Ribble Valley in Lancashire. And then at some point, when she came of age to go out to work, she would either have chosen to go to the factories or to become a domestic servant. And she chose, or maybe it was chosen for her, domestic service. And so she started out as a housemaid, and then you see that by the 1850s, she'd joined Anne and Adam's household, where she stayed for the next 20 years. She eventually married a builder called Joseph. And then there's the Preston Guild, where this swatch of fabric that kind of set me on the path to this all along. And the Preston Guild, anyone that's interested in kind of early the movement that was known as the Chartist riots that took place in the UK at this time, Preston and this album came to be at the heart of it. The swatch that was included as being part of the Preston Guild actually took place only about a week after some Chartist riots had threatened the security of the town. The Riot Act was read, and the poor striking textile workers were shot at by the militia, and two rioters were shot dead. So it was a really tumultuous time that this album covers in all sorts of different ways. The point that I knew that this book was meant to come to me was when I first did the transcription and I was working my way through, this piece of fabric fell out of the back, and that was when I knew it was always meant to come to me. So I had spent 10 years, my doctoral research, and anyone that came to the presentation I did for the Arts Club a little while ago will know that I spent a long time researching the wardrobe of Queen Alexandra. And in the back of the book, wedged into the back cover, was this swatch that read, "Dress worn by Queen Alexandra. It was given me in 1912 by her dressmaker's sister." I know nothing about who might have put this there because Anne actually died in 1890. So it wasn't Anne. Somebody else put this in here, whoever was the kind of next custodian of the album. But it made me think that there was this kind of connecting thread to connect me and Alexandra and Anne. And so we come to the end of the story. Adam died in October 1888 and Anne died in January 1890. But before the book went to the publisher, I wanted to see if I could follow in the footsteps. I actually wrote this book all through lockdown. My intention had been, I'd started to write the book in January 2020, and my intention had always been that I would be able to visit lots of archives and see all of these different places. And then lockdown happened and I had to write and research entirely from home at the same time as homeschooling and teaching online, which was just awful. And so it kind of became my escape. And so we went in January 2021, we went in search of Anne and Adam. This was their last house. In fact, it's not their last house. It's now the North Shore Golf Course in Blackpool, but this is where they lived. Their house has been demolished, but this is the view that they would have had in their final years. And so in January, I went in search of Anne. I visited Colthurst Hall. This is the view from that they would have had from their lounge window. I did actually knock on the door, and the lady who lives there now very kindly took me around and showed me the drawing room where that floral fabric would have hung. We visited Lytham, which is near Preston on the coast, and that sort of not very attractive looking block in the middle is actually 8 West Beach, which is where they lived for a time, and it would have been more like the villa on the right rather than the 60s block there. We stayed in the Imperial Hotel in Blackpool, which is where Anne and Adam were found on the 1871 census, looking much as it does now. And finally travelled to Bispam Churchyard, where this amazing ornate Celtic cross marks the final resting place of Adam and Anne Sykes. And I took a little plant. I'd bought a primula from Lytham, one place that they had lived, and I planted it at the base of as a kind of thank you for the journey that Anne had taken me on. And so, although the book has come out and it's been hugely exciting, things are still cropping up. So since the book has been published, somebody sent me this photograph, and the house that you see on the right there is actually Burton House, and that's the house that Anne grew up in, and the factories that James owned. So things still come out and people still have stories to tell. So I don't think it's over yet by any means. This is the UK cover. I know the American cover of the book is slightly different, but I'm hoping that the story is not done yet. And I'm hoping to get more pictures online of the swatches. So if anyone's interested, watch this space. But thank you very much for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was such a wonderful presentation. I'll just say that there are a lot of questions that came in, so we'll jump right into it. There's one that came in that says, I am reading the book and enjoying it immensely. This goes to your research process that you just touched on. She goes on to ask, can you talk a bit more about what it was like to do most of your research during the early stages of the pandemic? And Kate, I know that this wasn't your first book and it's certainly not your last. We'll get to that in a bit, but this was one that you researched in the sort of in the middle of the pandemic. What was that experience like?
It was odd in a way, because although traditionally, as a researcher, you expect to go to archives and you expect to conduct all of those things and take in all the richness of sources that you can from other places, thanks to the digital humanities and the kind of digitization processes that have been taking place over the last few decades, really, it meant I was able to actually find things. I think if the pandemic had happened 10, even 15 years ago, there's no way I would have been able to do this. It would have been impossible. And so it doesn't replace going to archives and seeing actual documents, but it did mean that the wealth of, being able to read newspaper reports from the 1830s from the Singapore National Library, they're just there, they're available, they're amazing resources. And in many ways, I found it quite comforting, because, as I say, at a time where I had 2 boys that I was homeschooling and I was doing my university teaching online, so it really did become an escape from all of that strangeness that we were all experiencing. And it was kind of like Anne's world opened up very much as ours was shutting down. So I was going to Singapore and I was going to Lancashire and I was, all of these kinds of virtual spaces. And yeah, I actually found it really comforting.
What a unique experience and time in your life. Melissa is curious on how the swatches are attached to the pages in the book. Can you describe that for us?
Yeah, they're actually very well fixed. They haven't discolored. There's no kind of blotting from the glue. And a paper conservator from the National Archive has actually had a look, and she thinks it's a protein starch. So either a rice or a flour glue. So a very simple kind of paste, actually, but it's just worked incredibly well, and none of the pieces have loosened or discolored. So it's very effective.
Were these swatches taken before the garment was made, or did they cut them out of the clothing?
It's very much the period where women are still buying the fabric, um, the length of fabric, and then taking it to a dressmaker, and there would be snippets left over from that process, and then they would be the pieces that get stuck into the album. So no, I mean, Anne wasn't kind of following people around with a pair of scissors and hacking at their dresses.
These are all lovely questions. One of them is this great one. Can you suggest a reason why Anne kept this diary? Was it maybe for her descendants or as an interesting pastime, like a written diary?
Mm. It's a really good question. Anne and Adam didn't have any children, so I wonder. I have thought it acts as a kind of autograph album, in a way. It's kind of memorializing the people that came and went in her life. So there are people that feature all the way through, like Adam, like her sisters-in-law, some friends, and then there are some women who are only there really briefly, just for the time that she was in Singapore, or just there's some people that maybe just have a couple of swatches. And I guess it's like all of our lives, you have people that you meet, um, and are firm friends for life, and then you have people that come and go. And I think it was, yeah, I think it was her way of kind of recording um, the friendships that she made, the network of women.
Related to that question, is this lovely one. Were you able to track down any of Anne's descendants and able to ascertain the history of her album? How did it end up in, scrap sale bin for pennies?
Yeah, I know. I haven't. That doesn't mean that I don't think it's possible. Because they didn't have children, I think when I read her will, all of her personal effects, her estate was the executors of her will were actually two of her brothers. And so I think the album probably ended up with one of her sisters-in-law. Um, but after that, I don't know. I have no
Mm.
idea. So I think it went down the Burton line, but I have no clue as to what they might be called now, or what, because there isn't any direct line of descendants. I know, for
Yeah.
example, there must be a photograph of Anne and Adam because they are wealthy enough and they're right at that time where everyone was having a studio portrait taken. And so there must be a photograph of her. But because she didn't have that direct line, it might be that she's just in some photograph album somewhere and she's like someone's great aunt and no one really knows what her name is, so I'm sure she's out there somewhere. I
Mhm.
just haven't found her yet.
This is a great question because we're all wondering, in hidden scraps, what is the meaning of clout, roulette, and pilch?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. That's a really good question. I'll have to think about that. That's not one that I've yeah, I'll have to think about that. I'll look at the question afterwards and give that
Absolutely.
some thought.
So, uh, for you, Kate, have you collected actual garments in addition to these swatches?
I have a few pieces. I do have a few pieces. I think because I've always had access to collections. So working as a curator over the years, and we're building a nice collection down at the university in Falmouth where I work. And so objects have always been really important to me, and the kind of stories that they tell, um, and swatches as well. But I don't have a big collection myself.
Mm, mm, makes sense. Where are the digitized Maria letters? Do you
Oh,
have?
yes. So they are, if you look, the Massachusetts Historical Society, their
Mhm.
website, um, I pretty much just searched for Maria, Mrs. Balestia was my first search, came up with Maria Balestia, took me to the Massachusetts Historical Society, and then there was their digitized uh, section. They are difficult to read, but very helpfully they've actually transcribed them. So a lot of them you can read a type a typed
Mm.
version of them, but some you have to have a go at reading yourself. But they are, yeah, they're remarkable. They're amazing.
Technology is so amazing in assisting with this
Mm.
gathering research. How did the undergarments change and adjust to the outer clothing over this period of time?
They will, because it covered that period really between the 1830s and the 1870s. There was a huge amount of change from the kind of bell-shaped or slightly narrower skirts of the 1830s, but with the sleeves. So she would have had sleeve puffs on under her outer garment that would create that very puffy sleeve of the 1830s. But then you go through the crinoline and the corset. It's all much more wearable than we might think. Don't believe Bridgerton and Gone with the Wind when it comes to corset, the wearing of corsets, the kind of corset myth. I mean, that's a lecture for another day, but it was all much more wearable, much more functional than we might imagine.
Would you say, do you think this type of sort of annotated fabric scrapbook is more uncommon, more rare, or would you say that there might have been other such dress diaries that have been lost over time?
I think that there are actually far more in the US. So there in the States, you have an amazing collection there. I found maybe 7 or 8 in different collections around the country there. So it seems to have been a much more common practice there. I'm sure there were others in the UK. I'm sure it wasn't just that Anne was particularly unusual, but I think maybe they weren't valued. You know, so often with things that women make, they get discarded because they're not perceived to be valuable or artistic enough. And so I imagine that many of them got destroyed, or maybe there's still some languishing in an attic somewhere.
Yeah. Um, can you let us know if there are any particular significance to the shapes of the samples? Or are they more just random?
I think in many ways she cut them to look like so you know when you sort of mount photographs, or when people used to mount photographs in an album, and you have the photo corners that you would slip the photographs into, and it creates really a kind of octagon. I think she was creating that effect. So when you look at most of the swatches, certainly in the earlier part of the album, she's cut the corners off and it's created almost as though they've been mounted into photo corners. I think that's the reason.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Very practical. And um, was Adam's work as merchant instrumental in Anne collecting fabric?
I think that and her upbringing, she must have been surrounded by textiles her whole life. I think her father's occupation, he was obviously looking at earlier records of his work. He had been very interested in some of the developments around the printed cottons, for example. And so I wonder if there were just pieces of fabric around the home. Um, and then, yes, I think Adam he dealt in other kind of goods as well, not just textiles. But yes, I think she was surrounded by this kind of rich, diverse material culture.
Just generally, what kind of response are you getting to the book? Are people, between last summer and now, are they contacting you with other similar collections? Have there been interesting or surprising reactions to this book?
Yeah, lovely reactions, because I think there's something very timely about it in a way. It's about valuing cloth. It's about connections and female friendship. So there's lots of these kind of shared things that I think continue. I had a lovely email from someone not that long ago. I'd mentioned somebody in the book called Miss Garnett, and I'd said, well, I don't know who Miss Garnett is, but I think, judging by the fabrics in the book, she must have been someone who was quite vibrant and colourful. And somebody emailed me just recently and said, I know who that is. She's called Martha Garnett, and she lived in the next door village to Anne and Adam. and she was really colourful. She was very instrumental in the local arts scene, and she was well known for being a bit of a live wire. And so there we are. I could kind of tell from her clothes that that's who she was. And so yes, I think still interesting stories to come out.
And did the process of, working with Anne's dress diary provoke you to think about dress and fabric as forms of writing?
Yes, I think I've long, ever since I started to work in and amongst historic dress collections from the age of 19, the idea that fabrics can tell you stories, even when you don't necessarily know who the owner was. I've been really interested in that. And I realised that it's always been about hidden women as well. So yeah, women whose stories rarely see the light of day. And I think um, that's what's kind of spurred me on to keep on trying to find out more about maybe some of the other women in there.
It's an amazing book that's wonderfully researched, and there's a question that's being asked that we're all wondering, which is, what will you do with the dress diary album in the future?
I think it will definitely go to a museum. Francine, who gave me the book, I didn't know at the time. She was in her 80s, and she was very unwell, and she knew that she needed to tidy up her effects. She did live long enough to know that I had found out who the creator of the book was, so she was really thrilled about that. But it will go to a museum at some point, but it's not quite yet. I'm not done with it yet.
We've got an amazing comment that's sort of repeated from various people. I love that something so everyday as clothing gives this wonderful window into the world. I wish we could know more about Anne. She sounds so interesting. And so my question for you, Kate, is what are some conclusions that might have surprised you when writing this book, from what you've learned about people of the Victorian era to studying the swatches of that time?
I think it's that sometimes we see the past as being a foreign country, and in many ways it is. There are so many things that are different, but I think at the heart of it, people are the same. And um, so many of the kind of swatches felt familiar in many ways, and the things that she was writing about, friendships and relationships, and all of those things felt familiar. And so I think for me it was that many of the things that Anne was recording were kind of enduring human stories.
Mm, mm. Taking a step back and focusing on you, you have been a historian for 2 decades. And for those who are interested in working as a fashion historian, what advice would you give to them?
I think there's increased numbers of academic programs that cover the subject now, much more than there were even 15 years ago. I would definitely say societies. So the Costume Society of America is an amazing group. Um, there are similar societies around. We've got the Costume Society in the UK. Things like this, network, meet people, read. Um, just familiarize yourself with the terminology. If you can volunteer in a collection, that's how I started. I volunteered in my local museum when I was about 17, and started to learn about textiles. And then actually got a job there. I just did a few hours a week, and then got a job there later on. So all of those things that allow you to just meet like-minded people and be determined. Yeah, I feel very lucky.
Well, Kate, it's an amazing book. Congratulations on this achievement. What's next for you?
Well, I'm in the midst of my next book, which is slightly naughtily at the moment called Undressing the Queen. And it's a kind of return to the royal roots, but it's looking at, I realize it's about hidden women. So I've always been really interested in the makers. So you see these kind of royal women sail forth into public spaces looking incredible in whatever they're wearing. But I want to know about the people that made the shoes and the corsets and did the embroidery and stitched the gloves and the umbrellas and all of those things. So actually it's the royal women don't feature at all. It's very much about finding the unnamed makers behind the scenes.
Well, how fascinating, because we don't know enough about them, but there are so many interesting stories about all of the people involved in dressing the queen.
Yeah.
I want to thank you, Dr. Kate Strasdin, for joining us. Thank you everyone for being with us. This has been a production of the National Arts Club, and for more information on the organization, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Thank you again. Goodbye.